Humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Obstacles to aid entry and impacts. It's curious how the whole world talks about peace, yet seems to grow accustomed to war. Gaza is the cruelest reflection of this contradiction. While leaders speak about human rights at lavish conferences, children die of thirst just miles from trucks full of water. And the most shocking thing is that this isn't due to a lack of resources. It's due to an excess of barriers, political, ideological, and above all, human barriers. Many believe the war ends when the bombs cease. But in Gaza, the silence that follows is even more painful. It's the silence of closed borders, of hospitals without medicine, of mothers waiting for news that never arrives. A humanitarian crisis isn't born solely of destruction. It blossoms from indifference. And this indifference is global, shared, and silently accepted by those who prefer not to look. What you'll discover here aren't just facts, but uncomfortable truths. Understanding what prevents help from reaching us is more than understanding politics. It's looking into the mirror of humanity. And along this journey, an inevitable question will echo. How long will we call conflict what is, in fact, the failure of compassion? Blockades at Gaza's borders and the challenges for humanitarian aid entry. There are times when humanity seems to stop before a closed gate. Gaza is experiencing exactly this. The borders, surrounded by walls and constant surveillance, have become more than physical barriers. They are symbols of a political and moral impasse. Trucks full of supplies wait for days under the scorching sun, while children wait for a simple bottle of water. International bureaucracy and power struggles transform what should be relief into a game of vested interests and distrust. Israel, fearing that weapons or resources might fall into the hands of Hamas, imposes strict inspections and limits the flow of entry. Egypt, pressured by diplomatic and internal security factors, also restricts passage. The result is a maze of checkpoints and negotiations where each truck becomes a victory won with sweat and patience. Humanitarian organizations, such as the Red Cross and the UN, report days of waiting just to cross a few meters, while time runs out for those who are hungry, thirsty, and have open wounds. This paralysis at the borders goes beyond politics. It's a cruel portrait of human slowness in the face of life's urgency. Each blockade represents a hospital without anesthetic, a shelter without bread, a mother without milk for her child. Amidst the desperation, volunteers and humanitarian workers become silent heroes, trying to bring hope through gaps that insist on closing. But what happens when aid doesn't arrive? That's when the conflict changes face and becomes even more painful, as we'll see in the next section. Disputes between Israel and Hamas over the return of hostages and prisoners. Amidst the ruins and dust, there's a silence that screams louder than the bombs. That of families waiting for the bodies of their loved ones. Israel and Hamas have turned this pain into bargaining chips, exchanging remains as if they were chips on a table of power. Behind the headlines, there are mothers who keep yellowing photos, fathers who refuse to dismantle their children's rooms, and entire communities living between hope and unfinished mourning. It's a wound that never heals, because goodbye never comes completely. On the Israeli side, the government demands the return of dead hostages and captured prisoners, while Hamas uses these bodies as a tool of pressure to extract political and humanitarian concessions. This cruel and symbolic exchange demonstrates how war transcends the battlefield and infiltrates human emotions. In secret negotiations, brokered by neighboring countries, every name, every body, becomes part of an impossible moral equation: justice or survival. Meanwhile, the civilian population pays the price for the delay. Each dragged-out negotiation means additional days without respite, without rest, without peace. Pain spreads like smoke, and suffering becomes part of the routine. It is in this scenario that daily life in Gaza disintegrates, and the lack of basic resources begins to reveal another kind of war, quieter but devastating. The struggle for survival in the face of lack of water, food, and medicine. Effects of lack of water, food, and medicine in Gaza. When water becomes a luxury, life becomes a race against time. In Gaza, the sound that echoes in the mornings isn't that of alarm clocks, but of lines, long, silent, of people with empty water jugs waiting for a few drops of hope. The shortage hits the most vulnerable first: children, the elderly, and the sick. Dehydration, hunger, and infections spread like shadows no one can contain. And what was once a basic necessity has now become a matter of survival. Hospitals operate on a makeshift basis. Doctors use cell phone flashlights during surgeries, and nurses reuse gauze due to a lack of supplies. A simple antibiotic can determine who lives and who dies. Humanitarian organizations report that food arrives spoiled after days of waiting at the borders, and drinking water, when available, costs more than most can afford. The health collapse is not just physical. It is psychological, eroding the dignity of a people who have already lost almost everything. Even so, human resilience insists on flourishing amidst the rubble. Small communities organize, sharing what little they have, transforming bread into a symbol of solidarity. There are those who set up community kitchens, purify water with rudimentary methods, and distribute home remedies to ease the pain. It's the human spirit refusing to die, even when everything around seems to be falling apart. And it's in this tenuous line between despair and hope that the true picture of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza emerges. Social and emotional impacts of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. When a people spend so much time living with fear, fear ceases to be a visitor and becomes a resident. In Gaza, the trauma isn't limited to explosions. It lives in the suspicious looks, the sleepless nights, the children who draw tanks instead of flowers. War teaches too early what loss is and steals something that no humanitarian aid can restore: a sense of security. Daily life is lived amid sirens and prayers, where each dawn is a silent victory. The emotional impact on families is devastating. Parents who once dreamed of educating their children now wonder if they will live long enough to learn to read. Couples are separated, neighbors become strangers, and the sense of community is diluted amid the chaos. Psychologists and volunteers report a rise in cases of depression and severe anxiety, many untreatable because medications also fail to cross borders. It's an invisible collapse, but as lethal as bombs. And even in this scenario, there is something that insists on resisting: hope. It hides in small gestures. A child smiling with a toy made of tin cans, a teacher giving a lesson under a tree, a song sung at midnight to dispel despair. Gaza is a painful reminder that the human soul possesses a strength that defies even the logic of destruction. But the question that echoes now is, how long will this strength be able to endure without the world's real support? The role of the international community and the limitations of foreign aid. The world watches Gaza as if witnessing a repeated tragedy, with tears that no longer move as much as they should. Emergency meetings, emotional speeches, and promises of aid seem to echo in a void, while the suffering continues. The international community, divided between political interests and fear of commitment, responds slowly to a pain that demands urgency. Humanitarian aid arrives in crumbs, and the people pay the price for cautious diplomacy. It's like trying to put out a fire with a glass of water. In practice, aid faces obstacles that go far beyond willpower. Humanitarian convoys require authorizations that change daily. Donor countries impose conditions, and organizations face the dilemma between neutrality and impotence. Even world powers, which could intervene decisively, prefer to temper their rhetoric so as not to harm alliances. Thus, bureaucracy becomes a wall more difficult to cross than any physical border. And meanwhile, lives continue to be lost in the gap between one document and the next. But the true power for change may not lie solely in large nations, but in the pressure of the people. Social movements, independent journalists, and ordinary citizens have made more noise than many governments. The strength of the collective voice is beginning to break the silence, showing that solidarity doesn't need a passport. Still, a question remains. Will this mobilization be enough to bring about concrete change in the policies that sustain the crisis? Future perspectives, reconstruction, reconciliation, and hope, amid destruction. After so much pain, the question that hangs in the air is simple and profound: how to rebuild what was broken. Gaza needs not just bricks, but healing. Physical reconstruction is urgent, yes, schools, hospitals, homes, but emotional reconstruction is even more challenging. True peace is not born of cement, but of forgiveness. And this forgiveness, so difficult and human, begins within the people who have survived the impossible. Small initiatives are already flourishing amidst the rubble. Young local architects create sustainable designs for emergency shelters. Artists transform destroyed walls into murals of hope, and teachers continue teaching despite being homeless. These are seeds of the future being planted in the soil of pain. They remind us that rebuilding isn't just about raising what fell, but about reinventing our way of life. History shows that great transformations have arisen precisely from the ruins. Hiroshima, Berlin, Sarajevo, and Gaza may one day join that list. But none of this will be possible without a new perspective, one that transcends the boundaries of politics and recognizes humanity as a common ground. Reconciliation is not achieved through treaties, but through empathy. Perhaps the future of Gaza depends less on governments and more on the courage of people to continue believing, even when all seems lost. Because in the end, it is from hope that life is built, and it is hope that prepares the heart to understand what comes next. Lessons the world can learn from the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Perhaps Gaza's greatest tragedy is not just the suffering itself, but the fact that it keeps repeating itself without the world learning anything. The crisis exposes the frailties of our selective compassion, the kind that is moved by what makes headlines but forgets when the issue fades. It reveals how power still speaks louder than empathy. And yet, amidst the chaos, Gaza teaches us something no political treatise could: the value of every life and the strength of those who insist on living, even when everything conspires against it. If the world wants to evolve, it needs to look at Gaza as a mirror. Every bomb that falls there reflects global indifference to injustice. It's easy to blame governments, but difficult to admit that we all, in some way, contribute to the silence. When suffering is distant, our conscience relaxes. When it's close, our hearts awaken. And it is in this collective awakening that the chance for transformation lies. True peace begins when the other ceases to be the other and becomes one of us. Gaza is a living reminder that no civilization can thrive while ignoring the suffering of innocence. History will hold us all accountable for what we did, or failed to do, in the face of this pain. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: humanity fails not for lack of power, but for lack of love. It is this reflection that needs to resonate, not only in political circles, but within every awakened consciousness, ready to see beyond borders. The role of media and information in global perception of Gaza. The war in Gaza isn't just fought with weapons, it's also played out on screens. Headlines shape perceptions, and every word chosen defines which side the world chooses to take. The same explosion can be described as defense or attack, depending on who's telling the story. And therein lies the power and danger of information. The media doesn't just report the facts, it constructs the lenses through which the public views the conflict. Amid the avalanche of news, misinformation, and digital manipulation, truth becomes contested territory. Anonymous accounts spread distorted versions, while major media outlets try to balance narrative and political interest. Platforms like X, formerly Twitter, and TikTok have transformed the war into instant content, graphic images, without context, that go viral even before being verified. The result is a world that feels much but understands little. And the danger of superficial empathy is that it disappears as quickly as it emerges. But a powerful countercurrent is growing. Independent journalists, local photographers, and ordinary citizens risking their lives to show what the world cannot see. With cell phones and courage, they expose the daily grind of pain and resistance. They are small but authentic voices that break through the siege of disinformation. And perhaps it is from them that a new collective consciousness will be born, one that is not content with headlines, but seeks to understand what truly hides behind the word Gaza, the geopolitical impact of the Gaza crisis, and the repositioning of world powers. The crisis in Gaza is not just a humanitarian drama. It is also a geopolitical game where every move alters the global balance. The United States, Iran, Russia, and China are watching closely, calculating gains and losses. Israel, acting under the pretext of security, is redefining alliances and putting pressure on old partners. Meanwhile, the Arab world is divided between support for the Palestinians and fear of confronting Western powers. Gaza thus becomes the epicenter of a much larger dispute: control of the narratives and strategic territories of the Middle East. Every decision made there reverberates across distant continents. A ceasefire can lift or collapse stock markets, an attack can redefine energy agreements, and a diplomatic declaration can bring entire nations closer together or further apart. It's the kind of conflict that tests not only foreign policy, but also the morality of powers. After all, to what extent can national interest justify silence in the face of injustice? This is the question that looms large over the negotiating tables and corridors of the United Nations. However, something new is emerging on the horizon: a reconfiguration of power. Emerging countries are beginning to challenge traditional powers, and blocs like the BRICS are gaining prominence in humanitarian and mediation agendas. The game is changing, and Gaza is the arena where these new dynamics unfold. Ultimately, what's at stake isn't just territory. It's the kind of humanity the world will choose to defend. And this geopolitical dilemma opens the door to even deeper reflection on global responsibility and ethics. Collective responsibility. What each of us can do about the Gaza crisis. Faced with such a distant and complex scenario, it's easy to believe we can do nothing. But the error begins precisely there, in the idea of powerlessness. Every global transformation is born from small, local gestures. Staying informed responsibly, avoiding sharing fake news, supporting respectful institutions, and demanding ethical behavior from governments are powerful acts. Change never begins with governments. It begins with people. And conscious people move mountains that armies never could. Empathy, when put into practice, is a political force. Choosing to see another's suffering without ideological filters is an act of courage. Many think solidarity means donating money, but sometimes it means donating your voice, time, and attention. It means publicizing humanitarian campaigns, supporting independent journalists, or simply not turning a blind eye. Humanity rebuilds itself when each person decides to act as if the other's pain were their own. And, in a way, it is. Gaza is a reminder that the world only changes when we stop being. spectators of pain, and become participants in compassion. History repeats itself because indifference repeats itself. Breaking this cycle is a choice, individual, conscious, and urgent. And perhaps, in doing so, we will not only save a distant people, but also the part of us that still believes that kindness can reverse even the darkest chaos. Humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Obstacles to aid entry and impacts. In the end, the biggest question isn't what Gaza needs, but what each of us is willing to do. The humanitarian crisis exposes humanity's most fragile characteristic, its ability to adapt to the pain of others. But that's precisely where the opportunity for transformation lies. Because when one heart awakens, others begin to beat in unison. And it's from this silent current that great changes are born. Are we willing to look beyond the headlines, to question, share, and act, even when it seems small? Perhaps the true revolution lies not in weapons or speeches, but in the hands that decide to build bridges instead of walls. Compassion is a daily choice, and it is what determines which side of history we will be on. So if this content touched something within you, don't let it fade away. Reflect, share, talk about Gaza, and remember that every conscious gesture is a form of resistance against indifference. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue learning with me about what's happening behind the scenes. Because understanding is the first step to transformation, and transformation is what the world needs most right now.